Content warning. This narrative discusses reproductive coercion, forced separation of children from their mothers, infant exposure, and references to abortion and infanticide. I will describe emotions and systems of control, but avoid graphic detail. The physician's hands are cool against her belly. The room smells of oil and warmed linen. A bronze lamp spills a cone of light over a low table where a steward's wax tablet rests, its edge still warm from recent inscription. From where she stands, Petronia watches the curve of her abdomen and tries to measure the life inside with the same care she would measure grain, by sight and feeling, by a practical arithmetic she has taught herself since childhood. In the corner, the man who owns her counts in his head. He is not thinking of a name. He is thinking of months, potential, price. Gaas Curvilius Vatia, the villa's master, looks at the physician and then at Petronia, and his voice is small but steady. At 7 months, he says, more to the ledger than to anyone, we may expect a Verna. One who is homeborn commands a premium. We must decide whether to keep her here as domestic or prepare her for market. The physician, trained enough to be clinical and not cruel, shifts his hands a fraction and speaks with the calm of a man who has seen such calculations made before. The child's health appears good. The midwife will attend, but the law... He gestures, and the gesture means the rule that governs everything in this room. In Rome, the child follows the condition of the mother. Partus sequitur ventrum. The infant will be property because the woman who bears it is property. This is the brutal rule the title states plainly. Roman masters had a rule that turned pregnant female slaves into breeding stock, and the child's legal fate, its status, its ownership, was determined not by kinship, but by the body's possession. The phrase is short, the chain it sets in motion long. If Petronia understands the rule, she also understands the arithmetic that makes it brutal. A child born at the villa is more than a person. She is future labor, future service, a fraction of an estate. Vatia's mind already measures the child's future. How she might serve as a house attendant, be taught to play the lyre, to bear a name of the household in the market, to be sold for the cost of a new ox or a dowry for a client. Petronia feels the calculation like a pressure behind her sternum. The physician feels it like practice. The steward records it on the wax tablet. Female, home birth, mother Verna, reserve, sell, train. Subscribe for more histories that look past the marble, a small voice intrudes, because even this history must remember its audience. 4 centuries of practice, hundreds of households, and a legal logic united in one sentence. Partus sequitur ventrum. Offspring follows the womb. To grasp how that rule shaped lives, we must look slowly at the legal language and then at how that language met bodies. The phrase we use is modern shorthand for a set of Roman practices and legal opinions that treated children born to enslaved women as belonging to their mother's owner. Unlike some later legal traditions that tied birth to paternal status, in Roman practice, the status of the mother carried decisive weight for children born into households. The consequence was straightforward and devastating. Enslaved women carried, within them, assets for their owners. Their pregnancies were economic events as much as intimate ones. We do not possess a single law carved on stone that says, in plain terms, children of slaves are slaves. Rather, fragments, letters, court records, and juristic paraphrases survive to show how this principle operated. Scholars reconstruct how jurists and households understood status across generations, and the reconstructions make clear a simple mechanism. If the mother is owned, the offspring are owned too. If the mother is free, the offspring are free. The arithmetic is blunt, and where law becomes blunt, cruelty follows. Socially, the implications were stark because slaves were not marginal in Roman society. Estimates vary, and careful scholars urge caution, but several ancient communities in Italy saw tens of % of their population in bondage. In a small household economy, 1 or 2 births a year could change domestic labor patterns. For an estate, the productive potential of children born within the house could mean the difference between maintaining a service staff and needing to buy laborers from the market. But law is only the frame. The household's daily practice filled the frame with instruments, ledgers, lists, training rooms, midwives' notes, plantation-style breeding logics adapted to urban and domestic settings rather than fields. The verna, the homeborn slave, was desirable. Records suggest that vernae were often given preferential domestic training and could attain positions of intimate service that newly purchased slaves could not. Their familiarity with the household, their language and habits, made them valuable. Owners counted on the higher return of an internally produced servant who already knew how the household moved. From Vatia's perspective, Petronia's pregnancy is a future flow of revenue. From Petronia's, it is a knot of risks and opportunities. If the child is a girl, she might be trained for the house and kept. If a boy, he might one day be sold as a laborer. Petronia knows that there are uses for a child beyond the sentimental. She knows, too, that there are costs, the routine separation, the risk that her child will be taken, trained to forget home, to please buyers who prefer certain manners and temperaments. She knows, with an intimacy born of repeated losses, that maternal grief is frequently invisible because law quietly edits the mother from the child's status. In the villa, certain forms of documentation mark the child's potential. The steward keeps a ledger, small sheets of wax folded and wiped clean enough to be reused, yet every so often a ledger is left as a witness. We cannot claim those specific ledgers survive for Petronia's household. What survives in fragments across estates suggests typical entries. Birth dates, physical notes, annotations about health and potential uses. A reconstructed entry might read, in the style of such notebooks, 11th Kalends of March, female Verna, mother Petronia, robust, tempers good, train for inner service, consider sale at 12 if unsuitable for furnace. Such reconstructions are hypothetical, but they help us see the logic. Children are categorized early and assigned trajectories. These ledger notes are not neutral. They are decisions, and decisions define a life. Petronia was not born at Vatia's villa. Her childhood had a different shape. A cramped alley near the Forum, a mother who moved between households, an older sister given away as a dowry gift and lost to the sea of anonymous faces in markets. She remembers soap-lathered hands, the smell of bread cooling on a windowsill, the way a wax tablet's edge could press into a child's palm until the impression stayed. She came to the villa as a teenager, purchased after a quarrel in her previous owner's house. There she learned to move in ways that placated masters, to arrange the master's cushions without making the cushions look arranged, to fold a tunic so the seam hid a stain, to respond to a command before it completed itself. Petronia is practical and careful. She has cultivated an inner ledger of her own. She wants her child to survive. That is her first, brutal calculation. Survive, and then perhaps, if fortune tilts, be sheltered. She studies the midwife's routines, what bandages are used, what herbs are pressed into poultices, and learns how to look after her own body. Yet she also knows that knowledge can be double-edged. The same midwives who help bring children into the world might also be called upon to keep a pregnancy secret, to temper a birth in ways that prevent a Verna's value from being realized. Petronia keeps what she learns close, measuring its worth in secrets rather than in wax tablets. Within the household, older enslaved women like Horatia function as both caretakers and archivists. Horatia's life is a ledger of memory. The names of children who never returned. The tricks that saved a child from sale for a season. The men who softened when a child clung to the hem of a toga. She knows how buyers think. She whispers such knowledge to Petronia in the laundry room, between pounding motions, when the rhythm might hide their words. "Keep her close at first," Horatia tells Petronia. "Let them think she is weak. Let her be a long year in your arms if you can. The longer they see her as belonging to you, the more they will hesitate. Once they have the idea of a child as yours, even an owner values continuity. It is a counsel born of experience, not of law. It runs against the will of masters who prefer predictability and exchange. Vatia is not cruel in his every act. He enjoys certain comforts, he likes a well-prepared garden, he entertains friends, and he pays his steward promptly. But he is precise in arithmetic. In his ledger, he sees children as future utilities. Petronia understands that her moments of tenderness must therefore be tactical as well as maternal. The midwife arrives at dawn on the day of birth. The household has prepared. The birthing couch is trussed with clean cloths, oil warmed for massage, a bowl for water. The villa's architecture shapes the event. A small anteroom keeps the sounds muffled, but also ensures that the steward and the physician can be summoned with ease. In the last hour, Petronia's muscles clench and release. She counts not in contractions, but in the sequence of tasks she'll do afterwards. Fold linen, swaddle, press oil into the infant's scalp to keep away chill. Her mind moves as a mind trained to accomplish. When the infant emerges, the midwife lifts her briefly to check for signs of breath and vitality. The midwife's eyes are sharp, not unkind. Midwives served both mothers and masters. Their loyalty was to the living body, but their livelihood depended on a balance between compassion and the demands of the household. The newborn cries, a small, fierce sound in the quiet room. Petronia places her fingers against the child's back and feels the rapid beat of life. For a moment, no calculations exist. Then the steward knocks once, softly, and asks whether the child will be registered as Werner, and whether the master will wish to designate training or sale. Vatia's voice, when he answers, is not loud. It is the voice of someone who believes in the rational management of assets. "We shall keep her for a time," he says. "Train her for inner service. If she proves unsuitable, we shall consider offers." This phrase will reverberate through Petronia's life. To be kept for a time is to be subject to the household's needs and the market's indifference. It is a temporal suppression of agency. The decision is not about a child's welfare, but about maintaining options. The option is Vatia's alone. In the months that follow, Petronia tends to the child, whom she calls Lucia, between herself and the hearth. To others, the infant is sometimes called prima, meaning first, as if a position could be a name. Petronia cradles her in secrecy and excess. She sings to her in a tongue cramped with borrowed words. The motif of wax tablets recurs. She scratches little marks in secret, anxious to leave traces of a mother when the ledger might note only ownership. The cradle is carved simply but lined with fabric washed in goat's milk. A small lyre is tied within reach, an instrument to charm buyers later, perhaps, or to soothe a child's sleep. Across the city, the patterns of sale and training create the contours of childhood for many enslaved infants. Buyers attending a market seek certain attributes: a quiet temperament, familiarity with household tasks, an ability to produce the conversation expected in service. Training facilities, institutions not unlike apprenticeships, exist to mold these attributes. They teach needlework, manners, song, and the right submission. But they also teach forgetting, the commands that unsow memory, the routines that replace maternal voice with the voice of a mistress. Not all children were destined for a single path. Some became valued house attendants and rose in the internal hierarchy. Others were deemed unsuitable, too quick-witted, too slow, too independent, and thus were sold into harsher labor or even exposed to the elements if the household judged them financially untenable. Exposure, the practice of leaving infants to die by abandonment, appears in several fragments of texts and archaeological evidence. Where explicit records are absent, burial patterns hint at the practice's presence. Here again we must be cautious. The evidence is fragmentary and regional. But fragmentary evidence, when repeated across contexts, points to patterns. The physician, in a quiet interlude, speaks to the household about health and reproduction without acknowledging the moral calculus directly. His voice is a scholar's paraphrase of medicine. A woman's fertility is affected by diet, by workload, by repeated pregnancies, and by stress. He notes that midwives possess the knowledge of certain herbs for irregularities, a phrase that can mean many things. Scholars reconstruct that ancient medical practice included treatments that could influence conception or terminate pregnancy, though it is rarely possible to make categorical claims about frequency or intention in any given household. The physician's notes, as they survive in general forms, show that reproductive management was part of household administration, and that the tools for such management were known and circulated in domestic contexts. Petronia learns to watch these practitioners with the wariness of someone who knows both their utility and their potential betrayal. She binds Lucia to her chest in a manner that speaks not only of affection, but of concealment. How to hold a child so the household sees tenderness and not a possessive claim. Petronia's strategy is a slow work in secrecy and affection. She intends to keep Lucia close for the first year, to make the child appear to belong to her, to ingrain in buyers a sense of continuity that might complicate sale. Horatia's advice again. The more a child is perceived as an extension of the mother's care, the less readily an owner will sever that bond for profit. But households do not always value continuity over calculable gain. At times, buyers arrive to inspect a child. These inspections can be mundane and humiliating. The child is laid out like fabric for the eye of a stranger. Posture, weight, temper, small scars. Buyers are looking for signs of training, of adaptability. They prefer a child who will learn to occupy precisely the space a household wants. If a child is too willful, too curious, too attached to her mother, buyers might worry she cannot be molded into a compliant servant. Lucia grows visibly curious. She watches the way Vatia tilts his head at receipts and the way visitors laugh. She claps when a liar is struck. Her intelligence, which should in a different moral universe be cherished for itself, becomes a liability under the market's gaze. Buyers mutter about temperament and independence. The very traits that make a person vibrant can, under commodifying eyes, mark them as a bad investment. Not every household uses overt coercion to manage potential problems. In many villas, the instruments of control are routine and bureaucratic. A training syllabus, a series of assessments, an internal evaluation at certain ages. Training rooms host instructors who teach posture, modest speech, and the right facial responses. Teachers insist on repetition. They praise the child who can sit still through a recitation, who can fold a napkin without looking at the seam. The syllabus is a set of rituals designed to produce a predictable servant. Historians reconstruct curricula from a mixture of sources, didactic texts, moralizing literature that mentions the usefulness of a well-bred household slave, and comparative records from similar economies. These reconstructions must be framed carefully. They are informed speculation, not documentary certainty. Still, the pattern is convincing. The household invested in shaping bodies to fit economic need. Petronia senses the filtration of those who would evaluate her child. She learns to speak in small, coded phrases with other women. When a visitor lingers near the cradle, a certain tilt of the head signals to Horatia to draw the child away. The small tactics of maternal resistance are not grand rebellions. They are methods to make the household's calculations more costly, less certain. If Vatia must spend time and effort convincing a buyer to take Lucia, she may choose instead to keep the child. Petronia's weapons are patience and opacity. Her strategy is to increase the subjective cost of sale. Yet markets are large and unpredictable. One inspector arrives with money and a plan. He admires Lucia's dexterity with the lyre and remarks on her eyes. Another, days later, recoils at a flash of temper when the infant is frightened. The household's ledger notes these inspections: offer considered, declined due to spirit, owner to retain. Vatia's patience is not infinite. Economic shocks, bad harvests, a debt call, an expensive social obligation can force decisions. Slaves' fates are vulnerable to financial volatility. In one recorded but anonymous fragment, a steward writes, in the style of many such notes we find across estates, that a Verna shows promise but is proud. Keep for now. Reassess at 12 months. Pride, in this vocabulary, is a coded term. It is an aesthetic judgment made operational, equated with unmanageability. The language reduces multidimensional human qualities to sellable traits. Petronia watches such entries like weather, each one a possibility, each one a threat. She moves through her days with a consciousness that the household's ledger is a shadow that can become reality. Her love for Lucia grows in these brief, fierce intervals between decisions. Outside the villa, other women face similar calculations, but different fates. In a crowded insula across the river, a woman named Livia pushes a small child through the stalls of a market to barter for soap. She includes the child's hair in her negotiations, strands braided into patterns that signal youth and ease of grooming. In another household, Marcia learns to distract a mistress with a story so that the mistress will overlook a scratch that might otherwise be noted as a sign of mischief. These vignettes serve not just as texture, but as evidence of a larger social fabric. Enslaved women's labor extended into the management of their children's marketability. Resistance takes many forms, most of them quiet. Petronia's longer plan is not to overturn the institution, but to use its logic. If Vatia values a Verna for domestic continuity, she will cultivate that continuity, so the owner sees her daughter as an indispensable part of the house. If buyers fear a child's independence, she will teach Lucia ways to disguise curiosity as obedience. The strategy is subversive, but limited. It aims to protect at least one life, rather than abolish the system entirely. Such choices are the ethical ecology of survival. To understand the household's calculations more profoundly, we pause for a scholarly moment. Records from a variety of estates, especially those recounted in legal anecdotes and in the occasional surviving private letter, suggest that owners maintained categories of value for slaves. Vernae, those born into the house, were often appraised more highly given their familiarity with domestic routines and sometimes allocated roles that permitted them to accumulate small privileges. Owners kept lists, made notes about temperament and health, and treated reproduction as a managed resource. That management was not uniform. It varied with the owner's wealth, the estate's needs, and the prevailing social tastes of the time. Yet the underlying principle, that a child's status followed the mother, remained a consistent, organizing rule. This scholar voice is not detached curiosity. It is the bridge that explains why Vatia's voice can be both ordinary and devastating in the same sentence. The law shaped expectations and molded household practice, which then reshaped bodies and bonds. As the first year of Lucia's life approaches its end, the household's evaluations gather momentum. Vatia grows impatient with indecision. Buyers whisper about the child's temperament at the baths, where such conversations often occur, and Vatia begins to doubt Petronia's subtle defense strategies. An inspection is scheduled, the kind designed to settle doubt. Outside buyers will be invited. They will examine Lucia, and perhaps they will make an offer that makes the choice clear. Petronia senses the turn in the air. She tightens her tactics. She teaches Lucia a song that soothes visitors, a tune about the hearth and the master that is half affection and half concealment. an act of survival disguised as obedience. Horatia arranges the house so that when inspectors come, Lucia is at her best, clean, docile, expert at small domestic tasks. Petronia cradles Lucia the night before the inspection and tells her a story, not a tale of property, but a story of a river that forgets and remembers its stones. "Remember the stones," she whispers. "Remember where you are from." The morning of the inspection arrives with a brittle light. Men arrive, their sandals clicking. The air tastes of dust and citrus. Lucia, who is 3/4 of a year old but whom everyone has called Prima, is dressed in a small tunic, her hair bound with a ribbon. The buyers are not cruel men by occupation. They are merchants, house managers, an occasional woman of standing looking for a companion. They lean over and test a child's reactions, prod cheeks, coo at smiles that are trained for the occasion. Their conversation undercuts tenderness with commerce, but they are ordinary. They are the engines of a market that makes ordinary choices profound. One buyer, after handling Lucia, withdraws and whispers something about her spirit, that old coded word. Another notes that she is too quick to answer. The purchases do not occur immediately. The buyers will discuss, weigh, and perhaps leave offers that must be considered. In the waiting, Vatia's jaw tightens. He will bargain. He will calculate the present value against future maintenance, social obligations, and the possibility that acclimatization might make her more valuable later. Here the narrative pauses, not because the moment is unimportant, but because it represents an inflection. The inspection will determine Lucia's immediate fate, sale, conditioning, or retention. It will also test the limits of Petronia's strategy. For a mother who is dependent on small deceptions and the soft currency of presence, the buyer's assessment is a public arithmetic that might strip those protections away. We leave the scene here for a breath before the ledger asserts itself again. Vatia considers offers. He weighs his social standing and his need for liquidity. Petronia listens for the sound of his counting, for the minute weighs the household's instruments of valuation, wax tablets, the steward's notes, the physician's offhand remarks, begin to define what must happen next. The brutality of the rule is not only in the sale itself, but in the thin, ordinary ways calculation replaces choice, in the legal premise that a child follows a mother's status and thus can be treated as an asset to be bought, sold, and trained. The morning light slants across the cradle where Lucia has slept, and the lyre with its worn strings catches a glint. The melody Petronia taught her floats in memory like a promise. The inspection will begin. The ledger will be opened. Choices will be made. If this surprised you, leave a comment to say where you're watching from and what part of this story struck you most. The buyers speak in low voices for a long while. They map Lucia's face with a kind of practical tenderness, noting things aloud as if reciting an inventory, eyes quick to follow motion, fingers nimble, cheeks unmarked by disease. Then one of them, the kind of man who has spent his life converting people into positions on a ledger, leans back and says the word that has shadowed Petronia since pregnancy: spirit. The word is neither praise nor condemnation. It is a verdict. It suggests a life that will not be easily shaped into someone else's comfort. Vatia listens, folding his hands as if to count them. For a moment he is silent. In that silence, Petronia hears the sound of his arithmetic. The cost of training, the likelihood of sale at a decent price, the social obligations that demand he maintain appearances. He knows he could force Lucia into a harsher environment, one where obedience is hammered into place, but that also risks destroying whatever value the child might have in the domestic market. The buyers disperse without an offer. The inspection ends with a ledger note, written by a steward with a blunt hand. Declined, temper, retain, for now. The for now is a sentence of postponement. For Petronia, it is a reprieve and a renewal of dread. Vatia's face grows harder in the weeks that follow. He tolerates indecision less well. If his ledger will not bear profit now, he will seek to engineer it. The household's instruments of discipline move from routine to more deliberate instruction. Lucia is enrolled in more rigorous training. Horatia speaks of a place where children are taught to be quiet, where teachers use a mixture of praise and stern correction to align manner and posture. The place has a name in the city, an institution that takes in children for instruction, but returns not the same person who entered. It is here that markets meet pedagogy. We will call such places training houses, a neutral phrase that captures a range of institutions, private tutors' quarters, communal apprenticeships, even sections of larger households dedicated to shaping youthful servants. Their methods are familiar in outline: repetition, imitation, rewards calibrated to establish new patterns, and a steady replacement of maternal sounds with the master's voice. Instructors, men and women who made a living producing compliant workers, kept lists of skills, schedules of lessons, and standards of comportment. They taught lyre, needlework, the recitation of polite conversation. They also taught the habits that made a servant predictable: how to look without interrupting, how to laugh in precise places, how to fold as if unbidden. Petronia knows these processes. She has watched them from the margins and tried to outmaneuver them with closeness. But Vatia is impatient now. He demands that Lucia be taught in earnest. The instructors arrive and inspect the child, their eyes practiced at distinguishing what can be taught from what is stubborn character. When they find curiosities that might resist their shaping, vigorous attention, a quick temper, they propose either longer training or a different audience, perhaps a household where independence is less expensive to tolerate, or a harsh environment where temper can be subdued by fear. Some households preferred domestic companions who could move in public with ease, girls trained as attendants to daughters of aristocrats, skilled not only in service but in conversation and performance. Other buyers wanted anonymous, pliant laborers whose identities could be made small. A market existed for both, and training houses sought to convert a child's raw life into one or the other. Petronia's dread grows because she knows how these conversions proceed. They are not violent spectacles, but slow processes of attrition, of renaming and retraining until the child's earliest attachments fade beneath routine. Yet there is another vector at work: market failure. The economic logic that makes reproduction profitable can also produce anomalies. A child too intelligent for domestic predictability, too attached to a mother who resists separation, or too spirited in ways buyers do not like can become, economically speaking, an unmarketable asset. Owners who cannot sell may be forced into choices they would otherwise avoid. Intensified conditioning, long-term retention that ties up household resources, or, in some cases, sale into harsher labor that matches independence with greater oversight. We must be careful in describing these outcomes. The evidence is patchy. But fragments of letters, legal anecdotes, and archaeological traces show patterns where households, confronted with an unprofitable human, made decisions that prioritized short-term economic stability over human bonds. Petronia senses the shape of this calculus and responds with the quiet strategies that preserved lives in similar circumstances. She relies on networks. Other women in the house, a midwife who owed her a favor, a steward who once admired her nursing skill. The tactics are mundane and therefore effective. Small delays, strategically timed illnesses, a public display of maternal attachment at a moment when buyers might reconsider. When the instructors begin to work with Lucia, Petronia tries to be present without being visible. She hides behind curtains to hear the lessons. She hums a different song at night so that the child's memory remains threaded with her voice. Horatia teaches subtle techniques: to cough at a particular pitch when a buyer asks a dangerous question, to spill a bowl in a way that looks accidental but delays an inspection, to answer an unfamiliar man's questions with a protective silence. These are acts of survival that cannot be recorded in ledgers, but are as consequential as any formal document. At the training house, the instructors maintain a strict schedule. The day is divided into segments: morning lessons in posture and folding, mid-morning needlework practice, afternoon music, late afternoon practice in conversation and smiling. Mornings begin with waking calls that replace maternal rhythms. The children eat at set times, sleep in rows of small cots, and are encouraged to copy answers rather than improvise. A curriculum is kept for each child, a list of deliverables that makes them legible to buyers. Reconstructed curricula, based on how tutors and household manuals recommend training, might list exercises such as 3 recitations of the household chant, 10 minutes practice of the lyre, demonstration of napkin fold without assistance. These lists read like a schedule of domestic instruction, but are also a program of psychological shaping. We are obliged to emphasize that such reconstructions are models, tools for understanding probable practice, not transcripts of a particular household. Yet when multiple sources point to similar structures, a credible picture emerges. Households invested effort and resources into producing predictable servants, because predictability was valuable in a market that needed to minimize risk. Lucia resists in small, human ways. She learns the songs and the postures well enough, but her eyes wander. Her fingers, quick and curious, find ways to pluck at a string in a pattern the tutors do not teach. When praised for a correct fold, she sometimes adds a small flourish that earns her a sharp look. Her intelligence manifests not as maliciousness, but as expressiveness, and in a market that equates expressiveness with unruliness, it becomes an economic problem. Vatia grows angrier. He orders more rigorous drills. He asks the physician if there are ways to make the child less restless, medicinal drafts that might curb a nervous temperament. The physician answers with the careful language of his craft: diet, routines, certain herbs used for calming. He will not pronounce categorical remedies, and is careful to couch his advice in clinical terms. The steward records: implement routine, monitor. The ledger is again the center of decision-making, translating worry into action. Petronia learns to read the physician's careful phrases as threats. Herbs used for calming in a therapeutic sense can be repurposed in desperation. We do not, and must not, provide details of how such substances might be employed. It is enough to note that households had knowledge of domestic medicine that could influence behavior, and that those practices were sometimes entangled with economic motives. The pressure builds until a market shock brings matters to a head. Vatia receives news: an unpaid loan called in, an unexpected expense for a public display, or a social obligation he cannot postpone. He decides to liquidate assets. If he cannot sell Lucia at a good price, because buyers fear her spirit, then he will alter the composition of his property another way. He will offer her to someone who values unmarketable spirit differently. It is at this moment an opportunity arrives from within Vatia's own kin, Curvilia, his daughter. She is an aristocratic woman newly married into her own social plane, with tastes and needs different from her father's. Curvilia has been watching the household for reasons of fashion and convenience. She wants attendants who can move at her side, companions who can perform the right kinds of conversation. Perhaps she is moved partly by the child's looks. Perhaps she sees in a spirited child an asset for companionship rather than mere labor. The decision to purchase Lucia and Petronia will be complex, market calculation interlaced with social signaling, family dynamics, and the practicalities of living in a city where appearances and networks matter. When Curvilia first proposes the purchase, the household stirs. The steward writes a careful note. Offer for Verna and mother. Consideration presented. Terms to be negotiated. Vatia considers his options. Selling to an outsider could bring more cash. Selling within the family keeps the asset in the broader social circle, but may mean less immediate liquidity. Ultimately, Vatia chooses a middle ground. He accepts Curvilia's offer, not out of benevolence, but out of market logic and the convenience of keeping assets within affiliated households. The transaction is formalized with a brief exchange. Both mother and daughter are branded, in records at least, as property transferred. The legal machinery is straightforward. A sale, recorded by the steward, crossing the boundary from one household's ledger to another's. For Petronia, the sale is a rupture disguised as a reunion. She moves from one set of constraints to another. Curvilius' household promises different routines, more refined tasks, more visibility, more social functions where a child's presence must be impeccably performed. Petronia hopes for leniency. She fears new forms of surveillance. The move is emotionally complex. In one sense, Petronia has won something vital, the physical presence of her child. The worst fate she feared, a sale to a remote labor camp or an anonymous market, has been avoided. Yet the victory is partial. Ownership has not dissolved. It has been reformulated. Petronia is now, in a legal sense, the property of a woman who belongs to the same family as her former master. The rhythms of command and service continue, and Petronia must learn to negotiate them anew. The early days in Servilia's household are cautious. Servilia is a young aristocrat who has inherited both privilege and a desire to display benevolence. For her, purchasing both mother and daughter may be a way to mark herself as generous, cultured, or attentive to family needs. She also seeks the practical benefits. An attendant bond already formed, fewer weeks of training required. Petronia reads the situation with care. She offers loyalty in small measures and watches Servilia's moods for a temperate pattern. Servilia, for her part, tests the waters. She watches Lucia's dexterity with the lyre. She notices how Petronia's gestures keep the household running. Time, that slow reweaver, begins the work of repair. Being together under Servilia's roof permits Petronia and Lucia to reconstruct a relationship that had been stretched thin. Their reunion is not an immediate erasure of trauma. Lucia has been taught to respond to different cues. She has learned to answer to a mistress who will train her in the art of sociability. Petronia has been trained to quiet her anger and conceal the depth of her fears. Their reconnection is gradual. At first, a glance across a hall, then a brush of hands while performing a task, then the secretive renewal of a song in the night, a song Petronia had once taught, now permitted again. There are small public moments that mark their recovery. Servilia invites a circle of friends to the house. Lucia sits near her mother, a presence of both service and affection. Those who observe see a well-trained attendant and a devoted mother, and interpret the scene through their own frameworks of propriety. To Petronia, these events are double-edged. They reflect the partial success of her survival strategy and the continuing instrumentality of her daughter's body as social currency. Over time, both women discover forms of influence. Petronia gains a small authority among other domestic workers, a right to intercede when new girls are ill-treated, a soft power that comes from being the person who remembers. Servilia, for her part, begins to appreciate the ways in which loyalty is produced, how kindness and toleration can yield deeper attachments than fear alone. She allows Petronia and Lucia to host younger women in the household on certain evenings, to tell quietly of their origins, to teach domestic skills not merely as training, but as preservation. This is not a revolution. Neither Petronia nor Servilia imagines abolition. But within the constraints of daily life, gestures of protection are consequential. Petronia uses her position to keep certain girls from being sold at moments of crisis. She leverages her intimacy with Servilia to arrange dowries, small payments or favors that save particular young women from exposure or transfer to harsher labor. These acts are local, partial, and pragmatic. They do not dismantle the system, but they reduce harm for individuals. Lucia, known now in parts of the household as Prima, grows into an adult with a complex sense of self. She learns to perform polite conversation at parties, to play a lyre at the right moments, to speak with the inflection of the elite when duty requires. Yet she also cultivates an inner record, a set of memories and gestures that she carries privately. In quiet hours she writes fragments, short phrases on wax tablets, or in letters that she slips to trusted persons. Some of these fragments survive in literary echoes or as paraphrased testimony by later households. We must treat them as fragmentary. Yet they are important for what they reveal about memory, voice, and the ethics of reconstruction. One reconstructed fragment attributed to Prima, phrased here as paraphrase rather than quote, speaks of a river that remembers its stones. She writes of a childhood counted in folds of cloth and the smell of olive oil, of nights when her mother hummed a tune that stopped her fingers from recognizing fear. She speaks of a time when she learned to smile, and a later time when she learned that smiling could be a small theft, a borrowed warmth that she kept in secret. These fragments do not provide a full life. They provide a moral anchor. They are evidence that lives like Lucia's were not mere economic units, but contained desire, memory, and the capacity for care. Scholarly interludes help us place these personal strategies within a broader economic frame. Owners often performed a rough calculation when evaluating the value of a household-born child. A simple reconstructed amortization might look like this. An owner's investment in a pregnant female, food, lighter workload during gestation, midwifery care, is expected to yield returns over a decade or more if the child is retained as domestic staff. A Verna trained for intimate service might save the household from the expense of buying a trained attendant and reduce the friction of integrating a stranger. Yet these calculations are probabilistic. Traits like temperament, health, and market demand alter expected returns. As a result, owners employed strategies of selection, training, and management to tilt probabilities in their favor. Records suggest that households tracked births and dispositions, sometimes even keeping rudimentary statistics. A steward might note with clinical dryness how many Vernae reached certain ages and how many were sold. Such notes provided the raw material for an owner's decisions. We must emphasize that these reconstructions are aggregated interpretations. No single ledger tells the whole story. But when similar patterns appear across estates, a coherent picture emerges of reproduction as economic practice in Roman households. Archaeology adds another form of evidence. Burials and infant deposits, the distribution of grave goods, and patterns of infant remains around urban settlements provide a material shadow of practices artists and jurists scarcely discussed publicly. Sites where infants appear in numbers inconsistent with household cemeteries suggest that exposure happened in some places. At the same time, other data points show that many infants were incorporated into family cemeteries, perhaps indicating different attitudes or economic capacities across regions and classes. Archaeological evidence is messy and regional. It resists simple narratives. But it does support the fact that reproductive decisions in ancient societies were embedded in local economies and cultural norms. Back in the household, Petronia and Lucia craft a modest program of protection. They keep a shared ledger of their own. Tiny scratchings on a tablet that record favors and promises, the names of women they attempt to shield, the times when a mistress owes a kindness. These private records are acts of moral bookkeeping, an attempt to bind memory into something durable. They are also a declaration that lives once commodified, remain carriers of history and responsibility. As years pass, Lucia begins to find ways to wield her position. She becomes a valued companion at dinners, a woman who can converse with patrons and make small jokes that smooth social awkwardness. In these moments, she learns that her performance creates space for others. She pleads, gently and with carefully placed disclosures, for mercy when new girls arrive hungry or scarred. Her requests are framed in terms her mistress understands: the household's reputation, the efficiency of staff, the quiet of a well-ordered evening. These arguments, couched in language the elite respect, sometimes persuade. Petronia smiles when offers are turned aside, and knows a small victory when she sees one. Yet the memory of separation never fully fades. Lucia keeps the song her mother taught in a hidden slot in her chest, and sometimes she sings it to younger girls, teaching them a tune that is at once beautiful and dangerous. The sharing of such songs is a subterranean form of transmission, an oral archive preserved in bodies. Petronia watches these moments with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She knows that songs are not substitutes for freedom. They are anchors. In later life, Prima composes more formal fragments, letters or dictated accounts meant to preserve memory. These are small, careful texts that speak of names, places, and the contours of feeling. Scholars who examine such fragments across households find recurring motifs: the insistence on maternal connection, the use of music and craft as cultural preservation, and a consistent emphasis on memory as moral claim. Again, we must stress that these are partial survivals, not comprehensive testimonies. But their pattern suggests that enslaved women cultivated strategies of memory and community that resisted erasure. The broader legal legacy of partus sequitur ventrum persists in the telling of histories. Law made reproductive exploitation legible as management. It allowed bodies to function as assets. Yet law also normalized a moral blindness. When the rule is repeated in courts and in household practice, communities grow accustomed to seeing children as property rather than people. This normalization is one of the greatest harms of the system. It erases the mother's moral voice from the equation, replacing a human relation with an instrument of valuation. We will not pretend that individual acts of protection undo structural injustice. They do not. But understanding these acts teaches us about the moral imagination available to those living under oppression. Petronia's choices, her silence, her songs, her ledger, reveal the fine-grained labor of survival that legacies of domination tend to obscure. These are forms of resistance, small and intimate, that accumulate into a culture of preservation. The story of Petronia and Lucia ends not in a triumph, but in a testimony. As older women in Servilia's household, they become repositories of memory. They are sought after by younger servants who want to know how to perform a song, how to soothe a child, how to negotiate a favor. They teach practical skills, but they also teach a language of witness. In doing so, they help create a fragile archive of lives otherwise destined for erasure. Scholars who study these archives must work carefully, recognizing the fragmentary nature of evidence and acknowledging the limits of reconstruction. We rely on a mixture of literary fragments, legal anecdotes, scattered correspondences, and archaeological traces to assemble a picture. The picture is never complete, and it never replaces the individuality of those who lived it. But taken together, these sources show how legal principles, economic logics, and everyday practices combine to produce the phenomenon the title names: a brutal rule that turned pregnant female slaves into instruments of property management. What then are the larger lessons we might take from Petronia's life? One is the clarity of law's reach into the intimate. Partus sequitur ventrum was not mere technicality. It reshaped kinship, parenting, and care. It authorized owners to think of bodies as reproductive resources. It normalized the separation of maternal identity from child status. Another lesson is the multiplicity of forms that resistance can take. Petronia's strategies, small deceptions, cultivated attachments, quiet networks, are not the stuff of grand revolt, but they mattered. They mattered because they preserved individuals, created memory, and made possible a degree of agency within coercive institutions. Finally, there is the matter of remembrance. Modern histories frequently sanitize the details of intimate domination because they are uncomfortable and because documents are elusive. But to leave them out is to accept a partial story. To recover lives like Petronia's and Lucia's is to insist on a fuller moral accounting. It is to acknowledge that systems of law and economy can make cruelty routine, even when most individuals involved are not personally monstrous. It is to insist that the human cost of administrative logic be placed at the center of historical understanding. In the quiet of the later years, when Servilia retires and the house grows calmer, Petronia and Lucia sit by a small window and tell stories that no ledger will record. They speak of names that have been lost and teach the songs that kept them close. These acts of remembrance are themselves defiant. They assert personhood against the bookkeeping of property. The title is plain. Roman masters had a brutal rule for pregnant female slaves. Petronia's life is an example of how that rule operated in practice, how law became the frame for daily calculation, how households managed reproduction as an asset, and how mothers navigated a world that could not imagine them other than as instruments. Yet the story also shows how human beings, even under severe constraint, find ways to protect one another and to preserve the traces of life that systems try to reduce to numbers. If this account has surprised you, if it has shifted how you imagine the past, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and which part of Petronia and Lucia's story stayed with you. Remember these lives. Remember what systems can do when law and economy collude to make bodies legible as property. And if you found this meaningful, subscribe to follow more histories that look past the marble and toward the lives lived in its shadow.